Welcome, everybody. Welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz, founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. I welcome you today to our virtual reading group, which is continuing to read The Promise of Politics. It's an edited collection, edited by Jerome Cohn, a wonderful and important series of mostly unpublished essays of Hannah Arendt, or even drafts, many of them, most of them, that she wrote in the mid 1950s, as she was at the time thinking about writing a book called The Modern Challenge to Tradition, a book on Marx largely, but also since that book never happened, much of this material will find its way into her next major book, The Human Condition, which comes out in 1958, and which we'll read next. So today we're reading two short fragments. Again, both were within or parts of her manuscript, which she never completed, called The Modern Challenge to Tradition. The first, which is called in our book here, Montesquieu's Revision of the Tradition, is actually an excerpt from a draft that's titled Tradition and Past, which has now been republished in that draft form in the book, The Modern Challenge to Tradition, which is part of the Gesamtausgabe series coming out of Hannah Arendt's work. It was actually the first volume of that Gesamtausgabe series. So people who are more interested in that can pursue it. You know, it's a big book, The Modern Challenge to Tradition, but it's an amazing collection of her work, all the drafts and different drafts of her work in this period. And it's very rich material. So why is she talking about Montesquieu here? For Arendt, Montesquieu is a deeply important thinker, because he, above all, right, there's going to be different reasons, but above all, he provides a way out of the traditional understanding of power, right? Power within the tradition had largely been understood as the distinction between ruling and being ruled. So if you were a ruler, you had power, and if you were ruled, you did not have power. And again, it's not that that's wrong, right? But what Montesquieu understood is that simply dividing governments between people who rule and people who are ruled doesn't actually explain how they work, how governments work. For Arendt, she's going to take this insight of Montesquieu's about power and argue that the key to a republican limited form of government is that power is dispersed throughout society and throughout government. And she's going to make that argument later in the 1960s in her book On Revolution. But here, what she's interested in her reading of Montesquieu is that for Plato, right, who largely sets the tradition of political thinking in the West, he defined the essence of government by what is permanent, what lasts. And he said that the best governments are those that are lasting, that don't get corrupted, that don't, if you want the best republic, it's the one that lasts. The best monarchy is the one that lasts. And in general, a lawful monarchy or a lawful republican form of government or democracy is not going to determine whether that government lasts or not. Lawfulness, as Arendt says, limits actions, but it doesn't inspire them. They tell us what not to do, not what to do. And thus, simply thinking about power on the question of lawfulness and unlawfulness, or rule and lack of rule, doesn't actually tell you what really makes government work. And thus, Montesquieu understood that there must be more to government than simply law and power if we want to explain how governments work and why certain governments are different. And so his great innovation was to say that every form of government has a principle, what inspires the structure. And since there are three forms of government that Plato articulated, right? Monarchy, polis or republican government, and tyranny. Montesquieu then says there are three principles of government that inspire each one. The principle of monarchy is honor. The principle of republican or self-government is virtue. And the principle of tyranny is fear. It's important, she says, not to psychologize these. These aren't psychological determinations. They're guiding criteria. They tell us how people act and how they should act in public. So in a monarchy, you can have fear and virtue, but they're not the guiding determinations of how we should act in public. They can be in private. And so she says that for Montesquieu, a question emerges, which is, well, if virtue and honor are the principles that inspirit republicanism and monarchy, where do they come from, right? And how do we make good monarchies or good republics? And he says that virtue, the principle of a republic, springs from the love of equality. This feeling, this love of the fact that we're all equal. And as Hobbes says, we're equal in the sense that we have this political ability to kill each other. In spite of all of our differences, every single one of us has a certain fundamental equality. And that in a republic, we love and joy, or find joy in being together with equals. And arguing with them and persuading them, but not killing them, because as equals, we respect each other's rights, and we hold off on that, and we allow the sovereign to set these rules. And so there's this profound love of equality that leads to a virtue where everybody participates and everyone is involved, and we love being together and involved with each other. Whereas in honor, which is the principle of monarchy, springs from this basic love of distinction, that I'm born a nobleman and you're born a priest, and the other person is born a farmer or a tradesman, and that we're all different, and that these differences that we share, on the one hand, make us equal. We all are equal in our differences, but what we love is to distinguish ourselves, be the best tradesman, or be the best noble, or be the best cleric, or whatever it is that we are. And we recognize these distinctions, and we get honors for being the best of who we are. These two loves, right? Equality, love of equality, and love of distinction, are for Arendt together the basic fact of human plurality, right? She says human plurality the basic condition of both action and speech, has the twofold character of equality and distinction. And so for her, human plurality, right, the condition of action and speech, all politics is founded upon equality and distinction. And republics and monarchies and republics basically play to different sides of this fundamental basic condition of human plurality. And so for her, Montesquieu is important because he's the thinker in the tradition that turns us away from thinking of power just as rule and sees that power is actually about this love, the love of distinction and the love of equality that is, she says on page 66, the binding link between the structure of government and the actions of the body politic. It's this love of equality and love of distinction that link us into our government and thus make possible collective action and thus the power to build a world, to build a political world. And that is the great insight and importance of Montesquieu's distinction. The second essay we read for today, From Hegel to Marx, is also taken from, in various parts, the book, The Modern Challenge to Tradition. Well, that book is, much of it is about Marx. Here, Arendt is focused on one particular relation and question that connects and distinguishes Hegel and Marx. And it's related to the Montesquieu, which is helpful. So if Montesquieu's importance is to remind us of power as collective action that comes from a love of equality or a love of distinction that binds us together and lets us act collectively to build something. Marx's distinction is that he is the great destroyer of political power. She sees Marx as introducing what she calls the real and deadly anti-political principle into politics. If Montesquieu is the thinker of power, Marx is the thinker of administration and thus the destruction of power. Now let me give a quick caveat. This is not all something that Marx himself says, but it's what Arendt takes to be the logical consequences of Marx that are drawn out by Marxists over the 100 years after his death. And so, she takes Marx incredibly seriously as a brilliant thinker. She thinks there's fundamental contradictions that run through his work, as with any great thinker. And she thinks that there are basic insights that he had that, not in his intention or in his own thinking, but as they become played out, have proved to be incredibly damaging and dangerous. And so in this essay, she says that the only essential difference between Hegel and Marx, and the foundational difference, is that Hegel develops a dialectical method, a method of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, in order to explain the past, right? So Hegel is an attempt to understand how we got to where we are from where we started. And the entire project of Hegelian philosophy is reconciliation, Versöhnung. the idea of reconciling spirit and reality. How did we start and how do we get here? And Hegel says we can understand the present by reading the past as a process up to the present and showing how each stage of the past gets elevated until eventually we get to the present. And we do this through the power of reason, or what he calls the cunning of reason. We can, looking from here, we can look back and tell a story that makes sense and show how it works. Marx turns Hegel on his head, as he says, and seeks to prophetically project into the future from where we are now. And she says both of these are outrageous in their own sense. Hegel's outrage is that in reconciling the present, he excuses injustice in the present and says that whatever the present is rational. And so one of the very famous lines of Hegelian philosophy is that what is real is rational. And that means that whatever is the way it's needed to be. It was rational. It's a process from the past, and therefore you can't criticize what is. And this is an outrage. On the other hand, in his outrageousness, in his outrageous conservatism, if you want to put it in that young Hegelian sense, he was correct in his political instinct, she says, to restrict this dialectical method to thinking the past. Whereas Marx introduces, she says, the truly deadly anti-political principle into politics by seeking to prophetically take where we are now and say, from where we are now, we can actually find out where the future truth should be, and we can seek to impose it on the present. So, as I said, that for Arendt, it's not Marx himself who brings out the awful consequences of Marxism, but Marx himself did accept the dialectic, this idea that there's a rationality to history that can be that can be understood from the past and now projected into the future, as a process, and that this process, she says, is a devastating logic whose apparatus of violence is subject to no constraints of reality. This is on page 74. The point is that once you start with an idea, right? Take an idea. And she, in her work, uses a couple of them, and I'll use three. Take Darwinian evolution. That's an idea. There's nothing dangerous in the idea of Darwinian evolution. It's a thesis. It may or may not be true, and we can talk about it, and it may lead to some bad things, but it's there. But when that idea of evolution becomes a thesis called survival of the fittest, in which evolution is justified, and whoever survives and whoever doesn't survive, they were meant to survive or not survive, then you've moved from an idea to an ideology. The two other great ideologies that she talks about in the 20th century are racism and classism, or Marxism. And so she says there's a difference between race thinking, where you think about races and think about that there are Jews and Christians and Europeans and Asians, or whatever races you think about, and there's all sorts of problems with it. And race thinking can be insidious, but it's not dangerous in the sense that we think of racism as dangerous. But when you move from race thinking into racism as a series of logical premises that start from an idea, and from this idea unleash us what she calls a single gigantic developmental process that opens a path to truly ideological thinking that seeks to explain everything according to race. That's not race thinking, that's racism. And if you start with the idea of class, that there's competition between the classes, but then you end up to the premise or the ideology that the proletariat is the class that has the right to rule the world, you end up with a gigantic developmental process that opens the idea to justify all sorts of violence in the name of an ideology. And so this insistence that we can, as she says in the 11th thesis on Feuerbach on page 77 in this text, that we can find in action a revealed truth and try and impose that truth on reality, allows us to actually divorce ourselves from reality, to live in a logical world of ideologies. And that's what she sees Marx, in some sense, not himself having done, but his thinking having unleashed into the world. Because he thus unleashes this idea of ideological thinking in the world, right? At the core of ideological thinking is a rejection of freedom, a rejection of action, right? At the core of the idea of freedom is that we act in spontaneous and new and uncontrolled ways, that action can't be simply human action can't be predicted and controlled. But for Marx, the entire goal is to do away with distinctions between rulers and ruled. And the Marxist communist citizen is supposed to be someone who is not ruled, who is free. But freedom now means to live under a system of utopia that replaces the violence of the state and the violence of the police and the violence of the army with a kind of silken robes of administration, of bureaucracy, of a natural scientist who doesn't make or invent laws, but only formulates them, so that man has only to live in conformity with his own nature to remain within the realm of law. And so for Marx, we see freedom not as connected to speech and spontaneity and unpredictability and humanity, but freedom is now seen as an administration. And he says that this is more of an error. This error of Marx as well as Lenin is to make mere administration, in contrast to government, the adequate form of living together of men under the condition of radical and universal equality. And when you live together under administration, there is nobody there to take responsibility. There's nobody there that you can complain to because there's no one ruling. We're ruled by, if you want to be provocative about it, a kind of educated expert elites. And this no-man rule of scientists and elites that is supposed to lead to our being free means that nobody is the ruler. That means there's nobody who we can argue with or complain to. And this, she says, while it's not the same as tyranny, is a kind of tyranny. This is the way that Arendt says that Marx introduces the anti-political principle into the world, namely the principle of administration. So I'll stop there with an introduction. There's a lot of rich material for us to talk about today. Whenever we have Marx and Montesquieu on the table, I'm sure there'll be a lot to talk about. So those of you who know, there's two ways to participate in the discussion. One is to join the chat. I sometimes get to it, I sometimes don't. The other is to raise your hand by going to the participants, finding your name and hitting raise hand next to your name. So the first question comes from Alex. Hi, Alex.
Hi there, Roger. Can you hear me?
Alex, I can't hear you. Oh, was it me? Oh, go ahead, Alex. Now maybe I can.
Hello?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Is it coming through?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, great. Thanks, Roger. Thanks for the overview. My question is about those two sides of plurality that she speaks about in the Montesquieu paper. So I find that to be a really powerful analysis. I'm wondering if she ever discusses some way of bringing those two together, because it seems to me one conclusion that could be drawn is that aristocracy and republicanism both have a certain flaw in them, in that they privilege one aspect over the other. And I'm wondering, does she ever discuss, something like a form of government that can honor both sides, or is that possible by her lights, or is it always a kind of maybe like a principle of change, or that there is always a kind of deficiency in political life?
Thanks, Alex. It's a great question. And I agree with you that this sort of her idea of plurality, which is one of the obviously absolute core thoughts of Hannah Arendt's, which comes from this dual love of equality and distinction, is a beautiful and important thought. And your question of, well, do we have to choose? Do we have to either live in a republic of loving equality or an aristocracy of loving distinction? And you can't have both. So there's a couple things to say about it. One is, she's talking here about the public character, right? So even though you live in a republic and everyone is equal and there's a joy in equality, that doesn't mean you can't have aristocratic institutions, and institutions in which honor and distinction play incredible roles. The great text here really is still Tocqueville. His claim is that, at least in New England, America is a democracy in spirit, but it's filled with all these intermediate institutions, whether it's academic, universities or lawyers' guilds or others, that very much run on principles of distinction. And he argues that to have a democracy or a republican form of government that's only based in equality without intermediate aristocratic honor-based institutions would be a disaster, because there would be no way for society to protect itself against the dangerous tyranny of the majority. And so this is not a complete answer to your question, but the first way I would answer it is that in any republic, there's going to be aristocratic social and even institutional elements, or there should be in her mind. And I think you could say the same thing about in aristocracies. There's going to be places in which people are equal, and one would be religion, right? Where they have the equality of souls. Obviously, these are not always enforced in reality, but this is the idea. The more provocative element of your question is, could you have an actual public government or public polity that was a mix of both aristocracy and republicanism, or a mix of virtue and distinction? And on Revolution, although she doesn't say it precisely in those words, she sort of makes the argument that the United States is that. She makes the argument that the United States, on the one hand, has a democratic spirit to it, and yet it has, in numerous places, it it's not to mention the fact that it's not simply a Republican form of government, and it's certainly not a democratic form of government in her mind. But what it is a constitutional Republican form of government and a federalist form of government. The constitutional element of the United States is without a doubt aristocratic, right? It sets a certain, clerisy, lawyers, judges, who are supposed to distinguish themselves not in their equality, but in their difference as thinkers of the law and of rights. And to the extent that the United States is a constitutional republic, it incorporates certain aristocratic elements into it. The United States is also a federal republic, which Hannah Arendt makes a huge deal about. And from that point of view, even though citizens are equal as United States citizens, there are New Yorkers and Georgians and Floridians and now there's 50 different states. And from Arendt's point of view, within New York, again, New York is a democracy, but within the overarching Republic of the United States, there are distinctions. What does it mean to be a New Yorker or be a Northerner versus Southerner, or an Easterner versus a Western? And that these distinctions actually are part of what makes freedom so much more living and meaningful in the United States than if it were simply a monolithic Republican democratic form of government. So again, she doesn't make it explicit that that's what she's doing, if I don't recall, in On Revolution, but I think there's no doubt that that's in the back of her mind as she's going about that. Does that help, Alex?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Good question. Nancy Felsen, you're up.
Yeah, I just wanted you to articulate a little more about stability and versus a dynamic quality. Is Hannah Arendt suggesting, as I took it, that Marx's deviation from Hegel is an effort to have impact on the future? It's an action that will lead to some kind of telos, that will lead to some kind of plateau or some kind of enduring polity. That's my question.
Yeah, I mean, so thank you. It's an important distinction, right? So if Hegel's dialectic, Nancy, is an attempt to understand and reconcile what's real with what ought to be, but also to say that what is now is a historical development from the past. But what Hegel says is what philosophy can never tell us exactly about what we are now or in the future. It can only tell us in the past. So the famous line, the owl of Minerva only spreads its wings at the dawning of the dusk. The philosophy, the owl, right, the god of wisdom, can only understand the past. It can only understand what's come before. Marx, in the Feuerbach thesis, says this is a problem. We philosophers only interpreted the world in the past. We haven't changed the world. And what Marx says is we should be able to not only interpret and understand the way the world has come to be, but understand the way the world should be. And we should be able to aim at a utopia, which is not simply my idea of a utopia or Nancy's idea of a utopia or Alex's idea of a utopia, right? But a scientifically determined idea of a utopia through a dialectical method called philosophy. and we should be able to figure out where the world should go and then help get it there. That's the utopian element in Marxism. And what Arendt says is that utopian element of Marxism is anti-political. Now, that's, of course, sounds so strange to us, but it's anti-political in the sense that it's anti-plural. It's anti-action. It replaces action with thinking, right? And it says that we should be able to think the future and then, through violence, if necessary, force people into it, force people to be free in the Rousseauian sense of the word. And that's a kind of politics. It's a kind of revolutionary politics that uses action to get where you want to go, violence to get where you want to go. But for Arendt, it's anti-political because it violates the fundamental principle of politics, which is plurality, which is that people are different and unique, and you can't simply force them to be free. Does that answer your, I think that's what you were asking, or did I not get it? You're muted, so.
Okay, I know. Yeah, it kind of does, but I also, I was struck by the influence of Darwin on Marx, as she puts it,
yeah.
And of this notion of synthesis, antithesis, I mean, thesis, synthesis, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and then the synthesis becoming another thesis. And the notion of irreversibility, like you couldn't, once you got it to a certain point, there's an element of determinism. And I was trying to see if that's connected to this quest in Marxist terms for a kind of irreversibility that is a kind of stability, that there's a kind of political stability that is imagined will come about if you only can get through that threshold to the next step and then turn the synthesis into another thesis. And I was struck by the unendingness of that chain.
Mm-hmm.
And the sense of human control of the future that seems to be very deeply embedded in Marx as Hannah Arendt understands it or describes it. So I just wanted to check that out with you.
Absolutely. No, that's right. That's good. Thank you. Spiros. Hi, Spiros.
Hi, Roger there. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Thanks a lot. As far as I'm concerned, Roger, in these two articles of Hannah Arendt here, articles or essays, okay, I think it's essays, we have a clear image, if I can say so, between a very basic conceptual binary of Freudian thought between power and violence.
Mm-hmm.
And according to this distinction, which is, as I said, so critical in Arendtian thought, for Arendt, power is, as she used to say, is acting, a kind of acting in concert. Okay, yep. This is a very, very well-known, very famous motto coming from Hannah Arendt. And violence, on the other hand, is a kind of administration or a kind of a logistics. Okay, we have, for example, Adolf Eichmann, which is the Nazi logistics and so on. And we know from origins of totalitarianism, Roger, that Hannah Arendt criticizes so sharply and so strong Thomas Hobbes, okay, and the Hobbesian image of power. And so my question is, according to this kind of analysis, I strongly believe that Hannah Arendt is a pre-modern thinker, okay? If Hobbes, for example, is the beginning of modern political thought and modern political theory and modern political philosophy and so on, Arendt is closer to the Aristotelian or the Greco-Roman kind of thought and so on, where politics is about acting in concert, and acting is a kind of pure event, and violence is only about administration, logistics, and things like that. So I would like to, if it is easy for you to develop this distinction, which is very critical within Arendtian thought, a little bit more for us.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Spiros. So Hobbes, for Arendt, is a brilliant, and maybe the most brilliant, thinker of liberal politics. And as Spiros said, the core of the Hobbesian thesis about liberalism is that man is not a rational animal, but is a power-seeking animal. He seeks to increase his power, and so Arendt thinks Hobbes gets this right, not as a matter of truth, but as a matter of understanding the bourgeoisie, the emerging bourgeois class that Hobbes, in a sense, provides the philosophy of. Her problem with Hobbes is that he justifies the bourgeois man's or bourgeois person's life of seeking power, but power understood as power largely in the social and private sphere. In big houses, cars, importance, money, things like that. And what the bourgeois wants, therefore, is to not be bothered by acting together with others in politics. They want to be freed from government. And that's where Hobbes develops the idea of representative government, so that the bourgeois can, in a sense, outsource government so they don't have to spend any time on it. And so the kind of power that Hobbes develops as bourgeois power is an alienation of political power, and an outsourcing of politics that Arendt sees as deeply corrosive of Republican forms of government, which require virtue, where people actually engage and love engaging with people as equals in the political sphere.
Or deeply unpolitical, Roger. Or deeply unpolitical, or adipolitical.
Hobbes, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. No, that's
yes.
what I mean. Yeah, I think I hope that's what I said. But yes, unpolitical. And so, from an Arendtian point of view, the sort of liberal representative government is actually quite depoliticized in important ways, and she's quite critical of representative government in that sense. That doesn't mean she's against democracy, but she realizes that in the representative form in which we've developed democracy, there are corrosive and depoliticizing forces. And so, yeah, I think, I mean, that's, and so in this essay, I mean, one of the reasons she turns to Montesquieu as opposed to Hobbes is because Montesquieu understands power as a inspiring political principle, not simply as a personal principle in the Hobbesian sense of a bourgeois. Does that help, Spiros?
Yes, thanks a lot, Roger. Thank you very much.
Yep. Bob?
Hi, Roger. I have a question about Arendt's conception of ideas in history, not in the writing of history, but in the historical record. And what triggered this was
Bob, did I lose you?
Statement on page 4. You hear me?
Now I can. 74, you said?
Are you, apparently,
Now I can. 74, you said?
yeah. The last sentence, she's talking about Marx's influence or effect. He made possible the kind of process thinking, you mentioned that, so characteristic of 19th century ideologies. And here's what triggered my question: in regimes whose apparatus of violence is subject to no constraints of reality. And so, again, I'm wondering about her conception of the role of ideas in history. Of course, the origins of totalitarianism kind of talks about this. She talks about, I don't know, the streams that into the development of totalitarianism. But in her other essays, or not but and, where she's talking about the loss of the tradition or authority, that's sounding to me like a judgment or a conclusion on the role of ideas in the 20th century. So if you could clarify that, I'd appreciate it.
So if you were breaking up a little bit, Bob, so I think I got the gist of what you were saying, and you'll tell me if I don't. I think that the important way to respond to you is to say what I was trying to say earlier, and maybe didn't get as much as I wanted to, is to distinguish ideas from ideology. Arendt, clearly doesn't have a problem with ideas. And, I think one of the ways that she gets herself into trouble politically or, judgmentally from other people today is her willingness to entertain bad ideas. I think that's something that Arendt is incredibly willing to do. She over and again, tries to take Nazism seriously. She tries to take Marxism and Leninism and even Stalinism seriously. She tries to take race thinking seriously. And in doing that, she she says, look, ideas in themselves are not bad things. They're ideas. People have all sorts of ideas. And they're part of, what Alex was talking about is the uniqueness and distinction of people and the love of uniqueness and distinction. And so, we have all sorts of ideas right now about, everything. I mean, religion or race or class or gender. I mean, you go on to Tumblr and you have 100 genders. Arendt would say that's great. That's ideas. That's people. Some of them you may not like, but that's ideas. The problem is not ideas. The problem is when ideas, as you quoted, Bob, become a kind of the idea becomes true, and we try and say that the idea has to be seen as true, or my idea is true, or classism is true, or racism is true, or whatever idea is true. And then we insist upon making it true. And that leads us to divorce ourselves from reality, which is always full of plurality and uniqueness. So, I think that's the distinction she's making. If that, I'm not 100% sure I understood your question, but I think that's what you were after, or not.
No, I wasn't after the distortion of an idea into an ideology, but the role of ideas and perhaps ideologies in the historical record. Given that she writes so much about the loss of authority and the loss of the tradition. And so I'm wondering to what extent those are ideas that she sees as kind of the engine of history, without thinking of engine in dialectical terms. You know, in other words, when I taught decades ago, maybe almost 50 years ago, German history and the Weimar period, the rise of Nazism, for me, it came out of World War I, the destruction that it wrought politically, economically, in terms of lives. For me, that was more important than the ideas.
Yeah.
And in fact, the ideas of Nazism, they're not ideas. You know, they're at best or at worst ideologies. So that's my question. To what extent does she understand ideas and not ideologies as moving the historical record?
Right. That's a great, okay. I understand the question now. I'm sorry. You know, and I think that's a fascinating question. In fact, someone recently, I forget who it was, wrote me and asking me about this question. And I wrote a long email. I'll have to dig it up. But basically, if you read The Origins of Totalitarianism, just to give one example, and in every chapter, she offers both what you would call idealist explanations or articulations of causes or the spirit of totalitarianism, but also materialist ones. So, for example, you know, we were just talking about Hobbes, and she talks about in the first chapter on imperialism, she talks about Hobbes's idea of power. And she says this idea of power, of man as a power-seeking proton, leads the bourgeoisie to seek economic power, leads them away from government. But then when they need to, they enlist government as, in a sense, their own private security force to allow for colonialism and imperialism. But she also talks about the recessions at the end of the 19th century and how that worked. And she talks about Rosa Luxemburg's, you know, Marxist theory of the need for mercantilism and colonial peoples. And so one of the things I think that's so wonderful about Arendt is that she sees, as you call, the driving force of history never to be singular. And not only to not be singular, but it's not ideas, it's not economics, it's not war, it's all of them. And she sees the world again, you know, and I think that's one of the things that a lot of more systematic thinkers don't like about Hannah Arendt is there's no system there. And inevitably she's going to leave things out, and inevitably it's going to be partial. But what's, I think, so from my point of view, so wonderful about Arendt is this sort of dilettantism. You know, we get poetry mixed with economics, mixed with philosophy, mixed with military history. And to me, that's Arendt's belief in the kind of the primacy of action over thinking. That there are incredible plurality of different thoughts, ideas, actions, events, all of which contribute to history. You know, and each one of us, if we're in this business, you know, looks at the ones that are meaningful to us, and we tell a meaningful story. And if those stories are meaningful to other people, the stories we tell become a little bit well known, and that's what's happened to Hannah Arendt. But she's not trying to tell a definitive history. At least I don't think she is. I've never thought of her as offering definitive histories of anything.
No, that's very good. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Ayala, how are you?
Agree.
Yes, thank you. You know, this whole topic of idea and ideology is very interesting. And I wonder if she is talking about what we call today memes what was memes before is they were pieces of information, but today we mean a piece of information that becomes popularized, and while doing so, it gets a force by itself and comes to sort of meta-existence. For example, racism. Racism is, yes, you're right, is giving more significance to simple biological difference, such as difference in pigmentation. A further significance, but not only that, it attaches, I think, the attribution of values to facts, to biological facts, is where the trap is to become an ideology. So Nazism was, in a way, I read the Mein Kampf, at least some of it that was available. And I don't know if there were some DNA differences between Jews and non-Jews, but the differences that they were able to pick, and they were pick and choose, of course, and generalized, got accumulated a lot of negative value that justified humanization. So the same thing is about distinctions and power. I think both of them, and she, I think, agrees, can coexist, and not aristocracy, but we can call it merit today, right? We need some merit in assigning not power exactly, but I would call it more authority that comes with responsibility to the experts. Experts do get some sort of power, which is the authority and the responsibility to deliver better based on their expertise. And at the same time, the society can be pluralistic in terms of attaching any rights. So the distinctions would be based on responsibility to deliver in the area of their merit or expertise. I mean, would that fit with her view on democracy and aristocracy?
I don't think so. Everyone just mute your mics because I'm getting some feedback. So, but I don't think so. Although it's an interesting question. One thing I'll say is that I don't think by distinction she means merit. I think that by distinction she means a kind of status, regardless of merit. And I'll use your example of experts just to make the point, right? What makes an expert have authority? It's an interesting question. But, Philip Tetlock, actually have the book right here, Expert Political Judgment, really interesting book, has over the last 20 years done all sorts of games and experiments where he's brought the leading experts from academia and government into contests of analysis and prediction with teams of amateurs. And over again, the amateurs beat the experts. And this has now become almost a common sense among people who study experts, that experts don't get answers right better than amateurs. So why do we listen to experts? I don't think it's merit. I have to tell you, I think it's status. And that doesn't mean experts aren't important. And I want to be very clear about that. Experts, because the amateurs use the experts. They listen to them, they hear them, they read them. But experts overvalue their expertise and thus don't take in dissenting and other opinions and other views, according to Tetlock and many others in this field. And I think they're right. And I think Arendt understood that, which is why she was so insistent that in politics, experts are to never be allowed, right? There's no such thing as an expert in politics. And that someone who's an academic or a climate scientist should be listened to for their information about climate, but not be listened to about how we should politically respond to the climate crisis. And Arendt really believed that. And so I would, you know, and for her, the claim that experts have a kind of right to be more, to have more say in how we govern ourselves, is a deeply anti-political and she thinks a dangerous claim. That doesn't mean we shouldn't listen to the experts, right? It doesn't mean that experts aren't important. I just want to be very clear, but it does mean that they shouldn't be. They have no one's an expert in political judgment. There's no such thing.
Yeah, you know, in this Trump era, things got to an extreme where the one who makes executive decisions all the time about life and death, especially the latter, is completely oblivious to scientists and doctor and the World Health Organization. So I understand that a sense of certainty and is always dangerous. But on the other hand, to let politicians use what experts tell them or abuse and misuse is also dangerous.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, she doesn't say we shouldn't have experts. She just says that you should listen to them, but they shouldn't have more than one vote. Right. And the problem is that I think part of the problem is that to the extent that many people in this country feel that for years the experts have not listened to them, there's now a kind of resentment that's making them not listen to the experts in a way that's dangerous and counterproductive as well.
Yes.
John Stern. You still here?
Yeah, no, just trying to unmute.
Yep.
Thank you. Roger, my question, or hopefully is not a comment, but I get the feeling that according to Arendt, that man really, when you look at the sweep of history, lives on a continuum. And when I mean the sweep of history, going back to Greco-Roman days and the different forms of governments, and it seems that we're recreating that. We go from one port of totalitarianism to another port of maybe republicanism, and then back to democracy, and then on to another. But we're going along a continuum, in that the only progress that man has experienced is really in the technological sphere. But man as a human, as a creature, as a species, has been flatlined in terms of emotion and psychologically, and we seem to bounce from one post to another, going from a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis that becomes a thesis, and then the whole process just seems to rotate. And I don't know. Is this a correct reading of Hannah Arendt, or is this my own creation that that's that a total misread? But I have this feeling that we're not talking, that we don't talk about progress. We talk about what we see as progress is all technological.
No, John, it shows you're really reading Arendt deeply. Arendt, is very clearly not only a thinker who does not believe in progress, but as she says, progress is an ideology that is dangerous. Insofar as it makes us believe that everything, that we can move in a progressive direction and make things better. It's a deception. But it also misunderstands what it means to be human, right? Which is not to, and this is something we've talked a lot about in this group, that humans seek the meaning of thinking and are not governed by truth. And so for Arendt, progressivism is a kind of potentially dangerous invitation to ideologies and scientism. Again, she's not a Luddite, and she doesn't believe that we shouldn't take advantage of expertise and increases in technology, and not at all. She's all in favor. But we should be aware that with every innovation, there's going to be things that we like and things that we don't like. Facebook brings good and bad. Artificial intelligence will bring good and bad. The Human Condition, right, which is the book she's sort of working to in these essays, is really a book that asks the question of what happens to the human condition with the rise of modern science. And as we increasingly seek to control and improve and remake and understand the world in ways that were unfathomable to humanity for thousands of years, will that change the very nature of what it means to be human? And she's going to rephrase that as not the nature of what it means to be human, but the condition of what it means to be human. We'll get there. But, she says, look, and she goes, in asking this question, I'm not trying to say it's good, and I'm not trying to say it's bad. I'm trying to think what we are doing, as the word she'll use, and to think it through.
Does she ever get to a conclusion?
I mean, she has her judgments, but they're not true. They're her judgments, right? But yeah, I don't think she believes there's a way, there's not a path forward that will lead to the true answer. And so for her, what we have to do is constantly hold on to our humanity as thinking, acting beings. And we have to keep I was with a very wise friend the other day who said, what I love about Hannah Arendt is distinctions, right? Hannah Arendt makes these distinctions: public, private, social, thinking, action. And from her point of view, humanity is made up of all sorts of different realms and activities. And we have to keep, there's a lot of political desire to get rid of some of these distinctions, to say that the private is the political, or the social is political. I understand, she understands that, I understand that. But what she says is that the effort to improve the world by erasing these human distinctions is also dangerous, and we should be aware of that. That doesn't mean that sometimes we shouldn't take the chance and do it, right? And I want to be clear about that. Sometimes you have to take that chance. But she that's not how, she doesn't make that argument. She's not a political activist. And that's going to always frustrate some people. There are times when she does become an activist, right? She does in her life argue against McCarthyism. She argues, she works to save Jewish children when she's in France with Youth Aliyah. She certainly saw her book on origins of totalitarianism as a book aiming to resist totalitarianism. But those are, I think, rarities in her life and in her work.
I take away from her writing so far that I know that there is the dispersion of power is probably in the health of most systems.
Yeah.
And yet that the scalability is sort of a contradiction with dispersion, and that it inevitably leads to a form of tyranny.
See, I don't think scalability is a problem with dispersion. I mean, that was Madison's insight in the Federalist Papers, which is that you can actually create a large federal republic and scale it up and disperse power. The problem is not scalability. The problem is that if you want to impose a kind of social conformity on that republic, whether it's about national security and becoming an imperial power, or whether it's about, social issues, racial and gender and other social issues. If you want to impose those kind of things, then you're going to have to centralize power, not disperse it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Jack. You hear, Jack?
I'm sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I was just saying that the last thing you mentioned was exactly what I wanted to talk about, which had to do with the limitations of federalism and this is really in the context of Montesquieu, the limitation of federalism when the actions of the several federal departments, so to speak, in our case, the different states, or even cities or other entities, appear to act in contradiction to the spirit that is driving the government as a whole. And so, if you take exactly what you said, I mean, I'm very aware of the ways in which politicians maneuvered to change the way people behaved in the South, for example, when I was a younger person. It was very specific, and there was a mistrust of the governments of Georgia, Alabama, whatever it was, and they were forced to take on what appeared to be the national consensus around the treatment of Black people in their territory, and of course the war, which protected the Union, was actually fought over that. I mean, they actually call in the South, they still talk about it as the war between the states, right? And it was, the Civil War was really about the imposition of values, if you like, from the North on political decisions in the South. So I don't know whether there's a comment or a question, but I'm concerned about how this impacts the idea of plurality. So plurality implies that a constitutional government that is structured federally, especially if the federation goes down to even smaller units, is going to gratify the needs of a plural population. But if they're in conflict with the spirit of the government as a whole, or the country as a whole, the unit as a whole, then how does that get resolved? How do you maintain pluralism when there isn't common agreement on the spirit? That's really my question.
Yeah, it's well, let me answer that question and move on, because that's the question. You know, I mean, I can tell you Arendt's answer, which has probably gotten her into more trouble than any other answer she's ever given, right? Which is that we have to make distinctions between public, social, and private spheres, and that we live in a constitutional republic, and every person in that republic is to be treated as an equal, at least politically, and that has not happened, and it didn't happen for 200 years of the republic. And from her point of view, that was, to use a technical term, a shanda. And she says it was the original sin. It was the great sin. You know, she has lots of words she uses for it. But she thinks it needed to be dealt with, and it wasn't dealt with even by the Civil War and with the Civil War amendments, because Jim Crow and other policies didn't do it. And the civil rights movement was for her an important corrective. But, and this is where she gets herself into trouble, she draws the line and says, in the end, we can enforce the constitutional principles of political equality because that's what the country's based on. But we shouldn't enforce how people think. That's thought control. We don't do that. And we shouldn't enforce how people congregate and how they act with other people. That's called the freedom to socialize and assemble, and freedom to live a life with your friends and your co-thinkers. And so she makes this distinction between the public, the private, and the social that makes it much that preserves equality where she believes it should be preserved in the public sphere, but preserves plurality and uniqueness in the public and to a certain extent some social sphere. This is her attempt, and it's certainly been controversial the way she's approached it, to say the least. I think there's good principled reasons for what she says, and I think that she's right that if we don't preserve these distinctions, we risk a kind of centralization of a societal norm that challenges plurality. And yet, clearly, there was a profound and historical injustice in this country that needed to be dealt with and responded to, and was not happening fast enough, if at all, when we didn't interfere in the social realm. And by the way, not just around race, but also around feminism or gender, right? And I'm sure other religions. So these were complicated questions for her. She took principled positions in the name of plurality. I think people are, there's still a lot of interest in her work on this. It's just that there's also a lot of criticism of it, which I think is great. It shouldn't be above criticism, but I think the questions she asks and the reminder she offers and the warning she offers about the dangers of seeking to impose social conformity are deeply relevant and meaningful today.
So just to round out what was driving my question, I'm mindful of Bill Jones' question in our discussions weeks ago, when earlier than the blow up, way earlier, right? When he was focused on outcomes. He wanted to know, how do I speak to young people from my knowledge of my past to have certain outcomes? And in our discussions here, we're very preoccupied with the difficulty of reconciling different ideas, the difficulty of making ideas function in a real social action, and so I have no way to answer his question, but I think what I'm trying to say is that one of the things that all of us here have to contend with is, okay, how will we now act, whether in concert or individually, it doesn't matter to me. How will we now act to achieve outcomes in the context of this this tug of war, which can be described philosophically, but which cannot be attacked or approached.
Yeah, Jack, it's a great point and question. You know, the first conference we ever had at the Hannah Arendt Center back in 2006 for her 100th birthday. Oh, by the way, today is the 100th anniversary of her passing. I should acknowledge that, December 4th. But was the first conference was about thinking. And one of the questions we asked was, is thinking important in politics, right? And you know, I think in a lot of ways, the question you're posing and the question Bill has been posing is, enough thinking, let's act. We got problems, let's do it. And how can we justify, and I think a couple of you have brought this up over the last few months here, how can we justify sitting here, you know, in our little snobbish ways, reading Hannah Arendt together for 90 minutes, you know, every week when, you know, people are dying or people are suffering and we should be out doing that. And, you know, I think my answer, you know, is you should all be out doing what you think is right. But what Hannah Arendt reminds us, and what political thinking, or hopefully political philosophy, or whatever I teach reminds us, is that if we're going to act, we should also do a little thinking first. And we should think about the intended and unintended consequences of our actions. And what Hannah Arendt is so brilliant at, and the reason I read her, and the reason I think it's worth having a, if you want to put it in these terms, not explicitly political conversation about Hannah Arendt every Friday from 1 to 2:30, is because she forces us to ask difficult questions that will complicate the simplicity of our actions. She will force us to say, if we argue for, you know, to use the classic example, to argue that everyone has to go to an integrated school. Is that denying plurality in some way? You know, if we're having a conversation, as everywhere I'm involved with in my life is having now, about decolonizing the curriculum, right? Does that include bringing in conservative voices from underprivileged populations? Or does it only include bringing in the right voices from underprivileged populations? What is decolonizing? Is decolonizing pluralizing or instituting a new ruling ideology? And I will tell you, there's not a right answer to that question, but it's a difficult question. And anyone who doesn't want to ask the question isn't having an honest conversation. And so, you know, the reason I read Hannah Arendt is because she makes you ask these kind of questions. And I hope that when you then go out to make the world a better place, you'll do it with these thoughts in the back of your head.
Well, thank you for that, Roger. That's why I come here every week.
Thanks, Jack. Ingi.
Hi, sorry, this is kind of stupid question. A really minor point. And thank you for a wonderful discussion. Is it, so concerning the logical extension of Marxism, is it contradictory to think that there will be violence of army and coercion, etc., and then there is a administrative robotic ruling that cannot be held accountable, because the first seems to have some kind of agency and willful manipulation, and then the second seems to be a bit robotic and has no agency.
So you're asking about the relation between violence and administration, Ingi, in that sense?
Yeah, because I felt like it's the first one is more manipulative and evils and things like that, but then the second one is very robotic and it's like, yeah, they're not doing anything, so they cannot be responsible for anything.
Right. So there's two levels to answer that question on, at least, and probably more, but I'll go with two. So from a Marxist point of view, which is not necessarily Marxist point of view, right? But from a Marxist point of view, because Marx himself was not a huge proponent of violence. But the Marxist point of view will argue that the way we get to a kind of communist utopia is going to have to include some violence. We're not going to get there without it, and violence has to be enlisted in the effort to bring about our utopia, communism. After that has happened and we've instituted the violence according to Marxist theory, then the state and the violence of the state is supposed to fade away, wither away, and we're supposed to replace violence with administration. In her essay on violence, Arendt makes another argument, which is to say, why is it that violence has become so popular again? She's writing this in the late 60s, early 70s. And why are so many people justifying violence? And her answer there, or at least one of her answers there, is that in a world that is increasingly bureaucratic and governed by administration, which she takes to be the sort of increasingly administrated Western governments, there's a sense of disempowerment and disenfranchisement, and she calls it in German Praxisentzug, the withdrawal of action, because we run by these robots, as you put it, there's a feeling of helplessness and powerlessness, and violence, including even random acts of violence or exaltations or exhortations of violence, may not actually accomplish anything, but it makes us at least feel alive or feel like we're doing something. And she says that much of the justifications that we start to see for violence at this point are actually a response to the Praxisentzug, the sort of feelings of powerlessness that emerge from an increasingly administrative and bureaucratic state. Does that make sense, Ingi? No.
Yeah, yes, but it's just that because it seems like she was criticizing this logical extension of Marxism for kind of thinking that violence is a part of history, etc. But at the same time, she's also criticizing that the end result that they're expecting is this bureaucratic the robotic, the static thing. So I was just wondering, is it just like the two levels of criticism, or is there any kind of coherence in those two criticism, or not? Yeah, it can be just like two criticism.
Well, she's critical of Marxists insofar as they justify violence. And she's critical of Marx and Marxists insofar as they imagine that freedom will be found amidst bureaucracy or administration. They're two different critiques. Yes, I think they're separate.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
We're at 2:30. If I know some people probably need to go, but I have to see two more people who haven't asked questions yet, Fran and Susan. So I'll take those two questions and then we'll wrap up. Fran?
Thank you, Roger. I would like to come back to the text. And when I read the first text, I tried to imagine the Republic as a political body that is sustained or powered by the idea of virtue. The joy of not being alone in the world and sharing power.
Yeah. Okay,
so then I keep reading. I read the next article, and on page 77, in the middle, a little bit out of context, I stumble upon this line where Hannah Arendt writes, Lenin was not so wrong when he concluded that if nobody can be free who rules over others, then freedom is a prejudice or an ideology. Okay, and that made me think of, my question was, what place occupies freedom in a republic other than being an ideology?
Oh, well, okay. Well, I think that you've taken two things. So when she says that the ideal of virtue is sharing power and that freedom is acting together in concert, right? Mm-hmm. What she's saying about Lenin is that he calls that idea of freedom an ideology and a prejudice. And so against the idea of freedom, which goes back to Aristotle, that freedom is to speak and act, and thus to persuade people. Lenin says, well, if the ruling class controls the means of productions, they will speak and act and persuade people in class interests. And thus, freedom is not free. It's just the dominance of the upper class. And thus, it's an idea. The idea of freedom is senseless. It's an ideology. And so the very idea of Republican freedom would be for Lenin a prejudice or an ideology.
Okay. Okay. I think I understood this wrong. Thank you for clarifying. But nevertheless, maybe I got sidetracked, but that led me to this other question. What is actually the difference between a society based on equality and a classless society? Like a society where everyone is equal, mm-hmm. and a society where there is no class.
Well, okay, there's different kinds of equality, but I mean, in a political in a society of political equality, you can still have classes, right? You can have rich and poor, aristocratic and tradesmen, but they have different amounts of political, economic or social power, but politically they all have the same amount of power. That's what Lenin calls a prejudice or an ideology, because if they don't have the same amount of economic power, how can they have the same amount of political power, he would say. But if you want to say in a communist utopia, what's the difference between a classless society and universal equality? The answer would be nothing. Is that making sense, Fran?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think like since I misunderstood the first part, it makes a lot of sense.
Let me just say this, some of you may or may not have noticed that, but when I talked about Marx, I actually quoted a fair bit that wasn't in this essay. This is a 10-page essay that is taken from over 150 pages from this book. And in fact, I reread the 150 pages from this book this week to prepare for this 10 pages, because I think it is a little hard sometimes just to get it from the 10 pages. So this was a hard essay.
Roger, could you give us the title of the book again?
Oh yeah, I said it earlier, but it's called The Modern Challenge to Tradition, Fragments of a Book, Fragmente eines Buchs. It just came out last year. It's from the Gesamtausgabe, and it's published by Wallstein in Germany, but you can get a copy of it online. Susan, you get the last question.
Okay, so on page 68, she talks about fear and powerlessness, and she winds up at the bottom saying, politically speaking, fear, and I am not talking about anxiety, is despair over my impotence when I've reached the limits within which action is possible. Sooner or later, every human life experiences these limits. And I'm just wondering if that's part of what we're seeing in the 73 million people who are experiencing powerlessness, and that somehow the fear that they're adhering to is connected to what we're seeing. I just struck me that whole paragraph.
Yeah, I think it's not 73 million. I think it's 150 million.
Uh-huh.
And I think
we're all
I think one of the reasons you're seeing such polarization right now is so many people on so many sides feel powerlessness and feel fear at a despair at their powerlessness and impotence. And that is, as I was just saying in the answer to Inji's question, that is a result of the dominance of administration, bureaucracy, and experts, and the increasing belief that so many elites hold that we should be governed by intellectuals or experts. And Arendt over and over again says that this is a disaster in preparation, and that the war, she says, the next great race war will not be black, white, not be Jewish, Christian. It will be those who claim to have more intelligence and those who claim that the intelligent are not listening to them. She says that in a footnote in her essay on violence. But to me, it's one of the most prescient and important sentences or paragraphs in her writing. We'll end there. Thank you all. This was fun. We're going to read for next week the essay, The End of Tradition. It's short. We could also read, if you want, part 1 of Introduction to Politics. I'll ask Craig to add that, just otherwise it's going to be too short. So we'll read The End of Tradition and part 1 of the Introduction to Politics for next week. All right.
Perfect.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
We'll see you.
Thanks, everybody.
I'll see you next week.